So Moira, who has been moderating a lot, she's also our next speaker. Moira, originally from Zimbabwe, she is the executive director of NORRAG, and she is a member, and NORRAG is a member of RECI, and she's also a member of the board of RECI, and she is together with Thibaut, one of the main organizers for today's event. She is also a senior lecturer at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and she has published widely on education and international cooperation and has produced many important studies for international organizations, including the Global Partnership for Education, the UK government, UNESCO, UNHCR, and Action Aid. And I'm looking forward to hearing her presentation. Thank you, Moira.
Thank you, Beatrice. So I'm just trying to work out, I need to change something here for the recording. There we go. Right. So the next session is really talking about domestic tax reform. So this really, really matters because fundamentally, if we do not have that that idea of the reason why it is that we're using tax is to make sure that we have a good basis upon which we can actually think about spending money on priorities. And here the priorities I've put, sort of the SDGs as the priorities that all member states signed up for in 2015. So, some people talk about this as the UN SDGs agenda. It was member states that signed up to this. And therefore, I think it's something that we need to take very seriously when we're thinking about how it is that we can actually move things forward regarding the arguments for why it is this tax reform needs to be put in place to finance education, to finance all the SDGs, and to really finance the ways in which education contributes to all of these SDGs. So here there has been a lot of talk around education, researchers looking at education receiving the smaller share of the public purse. So, our slice of the pie is not big enough. But tax researchers showed us very, very strongly that the public purse is actually smaller than it would be or could be or indeed should be. And that is only being exacerbated by some of the crises that we are very aware are happening, whether it was COVID-19 and the climate change shocks and stresses that David mentioned too. And so the public purse is, before any of these issues, was already smaller than it would be or could be. And now it has got even smaller with these arguments around austerity. And I think something that we need to take very seriously when it comes to conversations around tax, austerity, and spending is this notion of scarcity. Because the idea that there is not enough money to go round, there is not enough money to spend on education, there's not enough money to spend on any of the priorities that many of us in this room care deeply about, really needs to be challenged. And it needs to be challenged practically, but also in terms of the concept itself, because a scarcity mentality means that then you have hoarding. Whereas if you actually think differently about what is required and about how to get there, then you're getting closer to what David was talking about when you can actually talk about an investment. It's not about not having enough money. It's about making sure that we are investing correctly in education for education's sake and also for the broader SDG agenda, if that is what it is that we're talking about. But indeed, really focusing on this education as an individual good, but also very strongly as a public good and as a common good, and as a good that really makes an intense and deep difference in so many other areas of life that we value. And Now my slides are not moving forward. There we go. And so thinking about the sources of money and then also obviously the spend. Now, up until probably around 2005, there was a very, very strong focus on the kinds of things that we're talking about today. Taxation, levies from individuals, from corporations, and also from financial institutions. And let's be very careful to make that distinction between businesses and also financial institutions. It's a very important distinction to make. They should both be taxed, but we need to be careful that we're making recommendations that fit with both of those separately. But after 2005, what happened was an enormous growth in the number and the strength of the arguments being put around to fill this financing gap. What we need is actually more private investment and private sources of investment. And so this is just to say that this argument against taxation, against domestic resource mobilization, is actually quite recent. It's not something that is always the way that it has been. It is something that is recent. It is something that we can look at and we can say it hasn't always been this way, and therefore it is something that we can change. And what's important here as well is then to be able to say, so how is it that this money, whatever the money is that is being raised, is then spent? And an awful lot of it in low-income countries is being spent on debt. Those numbers that Tibor showed were absolutely frightening, particularly when you consider, in contrast, the percentages of GDP that are being spent on aid in high-income countries. And then also to say, right, and then what's left, if anything, is then to be spent on achieving the SDGs, if we take the SDGs, as I said at the beginning, as a sort of shorthand for how it is that we can use national resources and international resources to make sure that we are promoting the well-being of people and the planet, both now and also in the future. And thinking then around framing of this spend as investments and not costs, as David said, for SDG 4 and therefore for all of the SDGs. And the reference there by Stephen Nelson is a really good illustration of one of the things that David mentioned, which was about this shared beliefs and ideology. And he showed that the ministries of finance that shared the beliefs of the IMF staff actually got much, much better conditions attached to the loans that they were then given. So this shared ideology is real. It's a really important factor, and it needs to be taken into consideration when thinking about how to shift things, how to shift the needle. And here then, talking about tax justice, it is about then thinking about from all and proportionately. And that gets us into a specific and very useful vocabulary around progressive taxation rather than regressive. So regressive taxation, an example would be VAT, value added tax, which is basically a tax which everybody pays equally, regardless of how much income you have and regardless of how much wealth you have. Progressive taxes, rather, then take into account your ability to pay, and from those who have more, they ask more. However, the vast majority of progressive taxes even are still focused on income rather than wealth. And so this is another area where there is space for action. And when we're talking about notions of justice, we think also about government effectiveness. I'm from Zimbabwe, so I'm, sort of among the first to say, if we give more tax to governments, is that actually going to be spent on the priorities that the people have? And certainly, you know, research over time has shown that where tax has increased, then there is more demand for representation in the discussions and the decisions for money and national budgets across the board. So I don't think it's enough to allow others to say to us, well, you know, there's no point in asking for more tax if it's just going to be spent on Mercedes-Benzes sitting in garages. So then thinking about these leverage points for change, and when we're thinking about how you can actually leverage a system both more effectively and more efficiently for higher transformative impact, we're really looking up at the right-hand corner of this image adapted from Donatella Meadows, where we're looking at influencing the rules of the system and the structure of the system and moving up through there, where you can see with this metaphor of the lever that actually less effort has to be put into, or less energy, less force has to be put into changing these aspects of the system in order to get the system to move. If we are down towards that fulcrum of the lever, we need to put a lot more effort in order to get the system to move. So let's make sure that the actions are up at that end of the lever. And we need to think very deeply about how these things are all entangled. You'll have noticed from the overlaps between David's presentation, Thibault's and mine, and I'm sure Will's next, that all of these issues are very, very deeply entangled. In Australia, they have improved the reporting for corporations, insisting that they must do local filing. But, and I just want briefly to share this with you. I think I'm going to need to switch to a different share screen. I am. And I would like to share with you this, which is not coming up now. Gosh. There we go. Okay. Now we're cooking with gas, I think. Open the link. There we go. Right. And so now I will share this. And here you can see that here you've got something from the Australian situation where you have the average Australian salary, and then there is the house, the cost of a house, and then this is to give you some proportion. And the reason I'm showing you this is really to say that it's about being able to communicate these things better as well. So if these 243 billion tax cuts come in, then what it is that we can see is there's an awful lot of individual people's salaries that go into this and making these expensive things seem very, very small. And then making this example here, which is a very local example, and being able to then show how these local examples, when adapted to specific issues that people will care about to do with that, then really are a drop in the ocean to all of this. And it just goes on and on and on. And it just is a real strong visual way of making sure that there is a realization of the size of these things and what it matters and how it matters. And then also who's actually going to benefit from them. 53 billion, only 53 billion, because there's still 4/5 of the way to go. But actually, all of the rest of the 4/5 are going to be enjoyed by the vast majority of people who earn more than $120,000 a year, which is much larger than most people would be earning. So here, this is really to say we could be doing more here in terms of actually saying how it is that we are communicating what it is that we do and how it is that we could do it. And making sure that the audiences that we work with are the publics in terms of this media piece, for example, officials in ministries of education and finance, and also parliamentarians. And if you're interested in reading more about this, you've got a QR code there to the NORRAG special issue that David edited for us about 18 months ago. And you also have a QR code there to join the NORRAG network. You'll be very, very welcome to join us as we continue this discussion. And I'm very pleased to hand over now to Will to tell us more about where some of these sources just disappear to.